Welcome to Fat Chicks on Top. This podcast contains frank discussions about the body, sexuality, and occasionally uses swear words, which may not be appropriate for people under the age of 18. This podcast also uses facts, statistics, and mathematics, which may not be appropriate for liberal arts majors. And this podcast relies on science and reality, which may not be appropriate for evangelicals. Welcome to Fat Chicks on Top. You are here with your host, Auntie Vice, and it's good to be here. I have a super special treat, especially for my nerdy listeners, which are most of you. I've got Dr. Debby Herbernick on the show today. She is a professor, and she's written hundreds of articles on sex and sexology and research, and she's written popular books on it, and she's a consultant on it, and she's brilliant around this area. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Sexology is in terms of academia is relatively new, right? It's not like English and mathematics and, you didn't study sexology in, the 1800s as it is today. What got you interested in the topic?
Well, I think what got me interested in was that nobody ever talked to me about it. And so I, in undergrad, was studying child development and psychology. And then when I was graduating, I graduated a semester early, so sort of off cycle, and needed something to do for the semester while I was waiting to figure out grad school. And there was a really neat job here at Indiana University on a study about child and adolescent sexual development. And so I came onto that as a research assistant working with this wonderful postdoc named Meredith Reynolds, and learned so much. And couldn't believe how much I was learning, and couldn't believe how much of what I thought was true was actually wrong, because nobody had really talked to me about sex growing up in my family or at my schools, or very little at my schools, I should say. And so, yeah, it just seemed like that I had a lot of curiosity. I had a lot of questions, and I had met people who had ways of answering those questions, had ways of doing research that you could find out more. And that was a neat place to be. So I decided that that's the route. I would switch tracks and move away from psychology and child development, as much as I still love that area too, and go into sex research.
So for folks who may not know what this entails, it's not just watching pornos, right? It's for what is sex research for people who are not familiar with it?
Yeah, sex research is like any other social or behavioral science. It's just that those of us in this field study sexuality topics. And so I have, some people might study condom use and, how to get people to use condoms and learn to talk with their partners about condoms. Others study the actual transmission of infections or treatment of HIV, for example. And then some people study positive aspects of sexuality. I've studied issues around orgasm and pleasure. Some colleagues study, how you treat like erectile dysfunction or premature ejaculation. So it's this whole big universe of topics around sexuality, and people come at it from public health like I do, or psychology or sociology or anthropology or history, or pick your discipline. But there's really, lots of different ways to approach the study of sexuality and gender.
So coming at it from a public health perspective, the issues have changed. When I started the initial sex research, I was, interning on in undergrad. It was all around the first wave of HIV. Right? Obviously, that's changed dramatically. What are you now seeing? What are the popular discussions in public health, and what's coming up now as the big concerns?
Yeah, so, public health as a field, we're about the prevention of harm and injury. And so, what I personally am focusing on right now is a really dramatic shift in common sexual behaviors among young people, among teenagers and young adults. And specifically, I've been collecting data for several years now, both among college students as well as at the population level, big US nationally representative surveys on rough sex behaviors, and especially sexual choking, which is a form of strangulation. And so it has really big implications for people's short-term health and long-term health. And, and my sense is we need to learn a lot more about it so that we can educate people and then they can make informed choices, some of which may reduce their risk of harm or injury.
So it has really spiked, especially amongst college students, and this is out of some of your research. What is driving that behavior change?
Yeah, I think if we could rewind this about 20 years, we would see pornography as the main driver of the change. But I think that ship has sailed and that people who just focus on pornography are missing the bigger picture. And so for at least the last decade now, we've seen a lot of influences in mainstream TV shows. Even going back to 2008, we saw a mention of choking and Californication. We see it like in, this winter, December 2023, the number one song in the country for quite a few weeks was Jack Harlow's Lovin' on Me for 6 non-consecutive weeks, viewed on YouTube over 100 million times, using a couple million TikToks. And it talks about choking and talks about it as vanilla. So not just talks about choking, but says like, I'm vanilla, baby. I'll choke you, but I ain't no killer, baby. Right. And so it's in TV shows. It's like all over TikTok. It's all over like, social media memes. It's everywhere. And so I think that's actually a really important, issue for people to understand, especially educators, therapists, parents, anyone like who plays an important role in teens and young adults' lives, because it means that it's not just that your kid got access to like a device and saw a couple things on pornography or TikTok. It means it's a pervasive influence in their life. And they have every reason to believe that it's really normative and erotic and something, quote unquote, everybody does, because that's what the media sources are telling them. And often that's what their friends are talking about too. So they're really just a product of their culture. They're responding to what they're seeing the same way that, people think that like a certain car or like water bottle is the thing of the moment. But because this behavior is so consequential to their health, and safety, we really need to be talking about it.
Let's talk about what are those risks that people are taking on when you're engaging in whether, and let's start with by breaking it down. There are different types of erotic strangulation. There's some people will do what's called a blood choke, where you cut off the blood flow to the brain. Others will do more of an airflow restriction. And there's lots of ways to do it. So, and a lot of people think, my partner didn't pass out. We're having a good time. There's nothing to worry about. What is the reality of it?
Yeah, so I think one thing I'd say is a lot of people think they're doing a blood choke or think they're doing an air choke, but they may be doing actually both, even if they don't really realize it, because you can, the neck anatomy is all really close together. And so, physicians that I work with say, I don't think it's as clean cut as a lot of people think it is. It doesn't mean it's not clean cut for some people, but either way, it's still potentially consequential to health. So, when people often say like, well, we often hear that people say that if you press on the sides, it's a safe approach to do it. And I really like to ask people what they mean by safe, because a lot of times they're just repeating something that they were told by a partner or a friend, or they read online, they heard about it in a video somewhere. And so I think really from my conversations with people, what they really mean when you sort of like ask them about that is that they don't think that the person will die, like that the person's unlikely to die. And I think that's a pretty low bar for good sex. So a lot of people aren't aware that pressing on the carotid arteries in the neck, which is usually what they are doing or think they're doing or trying to doing in the neck, so that's reducing blood flow to the brain. And the blood contains oxygen, it contains glucose. It's really restricting blood flow, and the brain is built for like a nice continuous blood flow. It's not built for a restriction and then a sudden rushing in of blood. And so I've partnered with this wonderful colleague, Dr. Kay Kawada, here at the IU School of Public Health, who's a neuroscientist. and normally studies subconcussive injuries in athletes and soccer players, for example, and football players. And he led this really important pilot research a couple years ago where we recruited women who, young women who had been choked at least 4 times in the past month and women who had never been choked during sex. And, he found pretty robust differences between the brains of the women in these two groups. Now, it's not a perfect research study. Some people might say, well, maybe there's some differences that already existed that, made these people want to choose to be choked and these people not. It's possible, we certainly need more research, but it's really all in line with the direction we would have expected based on a really, really important and massive body of literature on strangulation. And even though people who engage in choking don't call this strangulation, if it's restricting blood or airflow, then it technically meets that definition, so that we can rely on that body of research on strangulation to help us figure out what might be happening to people here.
So you also are quite involved in, nationwide representative samples of people and their sexual behavior. For people who are engaged in erotic strangulation, how many of them are actually taking safety classes and stuff before they do this?
Not many. And so, yeah, not many at all. So we don't have as detailed data as I would like at the national level. At the national level, we know a lot about prevalence, like percentages of
Hmm.
people and sort of who is, right? So, for example, it is mostly something that teens and young adults, like adults younger than 40, are doing. It's more often like, affecting, meaning like bisexual women are more often choked than a little bit more than heterosexual women, though hetero women are choked at pretty high rates too, and more so than lesbian women. And then for men, it's more common among gay and bisexual men than straight men. So, there's again, like these
Hmm.
age and gender differences. When it happens between women and men, it's almost always the women who are choked. We have a lot more rich data on our college samples. So these campus representative college studies, and really just because it's more affordable to do that than the large nationally representative ones. So we're trying to get funding to do that. We haven't yet. But what I will say is from our interviews and really now many surveys, I think we've done like 7 or 8 surveys with thousands and thousands of people each time. And it's really the mainstreaming of the rough sex practices. So very few people are taking our classes or workshops. But I think one of the challenges is that because it's also a generational shift, is that we're seeing even within kink communities that used to be like really cautious about anything related to strangulation. Within kink communities, we're actually seeing a lot of younger folks saying, oh, choking is fine as long as you press the sides, and actually giving workshops telling people that. So we have one problem, which is that in the mainstream, there's not even an awareness of risks a lot of the time, and certainly no engagement with workshops. But even within the kink community, we have sort of different perspectives and experience levels where the elders are more often saying, this isn't really safe. And a lot of younger folks thinking based on like some of the social media that it is.
I've noticed that too because I'm in the kink community, and depending on who is organizing play parties, age of the host really determines what's considered risky behavior. And we see that in other things like suspension. Years ago, suspension was considered a high risk behavior, and now you'll have dozens of people at a play party suspending people without, and just thinking it's lower risk. So when it comes, especially you work with a lot of college students, and when it comes to reaching people that age group and maybe a little younger, you've written a lot about how to have these conversations for parents. What would be your advice for if you play, like I'm an auntie, I'm very proud of my auntie status in a lot of people's lives, but what would be kind of your general advice on how to have these conversations? Because it's hard to look at like your 18-year-old nephew and say, hey, if you're considering this, like not everybody's going to be comfortable talking about it or even knowledgeable about it.
Yeah, there's different conversations for different ages that are needed. And I did publish this book a few months ago called Yes, Your Kid, What Parents Need to Know About Today's Teens and Sex. And I have lots of sample conversations in there. I've talked with some parents who have read the book and decided to have this conversation with their 12-year-olds. So even much younger kids, really from the perspective of saying, you're getting into the age where people might start like making out and things like that, or you might, have see pornography if you haven't already. And I really want you to know about this behavior that you might hear about or someone might try to do to you. And it's called choking, and kind of here's what's involved. And if someone tries to do that to you, I mean, this is what parents have said, that they've said, I'm going to encourage you to like say no, to have them stop, to tell them, that's actually a really dangerous thing to do. Like, please don't do that to me. So I've heard from some parents who really want to preempt the possibility so that their kid isn't choked without knowing how to stop it or understanding that it's risky. So even with like younger kids, in those ages that might be getting into the making out stage, or might, the
Mhm.
average age of seeing pornography right now is 12. So average, meaning like some are seeing it at, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Some are seeing it in their teens. And then, yeah, for 18-year-olds, for 16-year-olds, for 20-year-olds, you can do it. And I think, one of the challenges is that this is pervasive in the media, but it's also an opportunity for teachable moments. So if you hear your kid listening to Jack Harlow, or that they watch The Idol or Euphoria reruns or anything like that, then go ahead and, you have that right there to say like, oh, like Jack Harlow loved on me. Like, what do you make of this? Like, what do you think choking is? What if your friends talked about it? And then share some information, but try not to shame them or judge them or make them feel bad about this. Because again, it doesn't mean they're bad kids. It means that they're living in this world where this is kind of the thing right now that people are
Mhm.
talking about, and they're getting a lot of misinformation about it. So you have the opportunity to step in, to give them real information, and also to assure them that like you're not trying to get in their way of them growing up or being somebody who's going to explore their sexuality at different, ages and stages, but that you do want to give them enough information so that they can make choices that will keep themselves and their partners safe.
You bring up social media a lot, and it's critical because, like your experience growing up, a lot of schools give little to no information around sexuality. If it is, it's largely heteronormative and just on pregnancy and STI prevention. And so a lot of people get into their teens and their 20s and they have very little sex ed. So more and more are turning to social media for information. If, and I have younger listeners and stuff. So if people are going, well, that's my where I access it. Is there any good information coming out on TikTok, on Insta Reels, on any of it that you've seen that you would say, yeah, there's actually ways to figure out who's saying good stuff and who's just full of it?
I think one of the challenges with TikTok is that it's so brief, right? So
Mhm.
I think TikTok is not a great platform for sex education because it's too short. And so I think, there's more possibility on a place like Instagram. I'll signal boost one of my former PhD students, Dr. Ashley Towns on Instagram, provides some sex education. So Instagram, Dr. Candace Harguns is another wonderful source, Dr. Shamika Thorpe. I mean,
Mhm.
there's great sex educators out there and sex researchers out there. But I think those longer form places, or where they can like link to more. But we have one of my current PhD students has recently done a project on TikTok and sexuality information related to choking. And it was just really dismal information, what she found. And I mean, really
Mhm.
overwhelmingly poor information. And so, Instagram for some like really, really good sex educators are some possibilities. I still think the website Sex Etc. is really terrific. And there's books like, Sex by Corey Silverberg, is a really nice one for teens. So I think, even though it might be convenient to look at some of these sites, if you're really trying to learn about sexuality, I would go, like podcasts like this one, right? Like
Mhm.
a little bit more longer form where you can hear it. You can hear people talk about it. You can hear a little bit more nuance. And you can, think how you feel about it.
And for our listeners, I'll make sure all of those links to all of the people and the sites referenced are in the show notes so that you can access this as well as a few others that we have that are favorites on Fat Chicks. So as you've done this research and you've been in this for 30 plus years now, what has been some of the stuff that has been most surprising to you in the field?
Well, I mean, the one that's really been most surprising has been this increase in rough sex. I mean, that's just blown me away. It's also surprising, I think, that we're not further than we are for like female sexual pleasure. That we really seem to have gone backwards in a lot of ways, and also just sort of like knowledge about your body, knowledge about genitals. I think we're still not really talking about that. Like sex education is still, and I know that the pendulum swings, right? I mean, that's part of what happens in the world. I remember hearing that when I was really young. I guess I hoped it would swing more in the direction I preferred for a long time, but right, I mean that is the nature of the world. So it does swing. And so I think that even though that's surprising, maybe it shouldn't have been. Um, but I do personally hope for a world where people have information about their body, good information, accurate terms, um, that they can be safe without sexual abuse or coercion and all of that. And that's been going in a negative direction as well. I mean, we just see like these rates of sexual assault, especially for teenagers, that have been really increasing in recent years. And so that's surprising and sad to me because I think we can do a lot better.
And with sex ed, there's so much moral panic right now around kids having access to anything related to sexuality, especially if it's LGBTQ kids. And your reason, this is your area of specialty. Why is it critical that we let kids have access to information about their bodies and about sexuality? That this is not grooming them, right? This is the opposite.
Yeah, sexuality education is important for all kids. It should be age appropriate, developmentally appropriate. But kids are curious. I mean, at younger ages, they're curious about how babies get made. They're curious of what genitals look like of the ones that they don't have, and they're curious about what their genitals might look like and their overall body might look like as they go through puberty. So if they don't get this information at different ages and stages, they will seek it out. And, it's really, and I'm a parent myself, but, it's
Mhm.
really one of those things where you sort of have this, as a parent, this moment when you realize like your kid can spell. And your kid's going to be able to type things if they have access to a device. So and even if you are kind of locked down, your kid may have more access than you think at a grandparent's house, at a cousin's house, when a babysitter's there. And so kids will, at some point have access to some devices, and even if they don't, their friends might at school. So we really need to balance the kinds of things that they might be hearing from rumors from friends, from online sources. We need to balance that with high quality education that not only gives facts, but that gives, again, like that nuance and that humanity side to it. And people have different words for that. I mean, some people use words like
Mhm.
values, some people use words like just sort of like more context and so on. But that is, school based sex education, when it's done really well, like comprehensive sexuality education, it provides this whole way of talking about it. And ideally, it's not done just like once in a given school year. Ideally, it's done kind of like the Our Whole Lives curriculum, where it's throughout a school year, different units, and it can help to keep kids safe. It can help them to feel more confident. It can help them to understand if somebody is crossing boundaries with them or trying to cross boundaries, and then they can identify a trusted adult and go to that adult. Helps them to feel good about themselves. If they are, if they are identifying as a sexual orientation that's some non-heterosexual one or some like non-cisgender identity too, it can also help have some conversations where they can feel supported and like they're not alone and that there's nothing wrong with them. And so, there for a long time, research on sexual and gender minority, kids and teens was suggesting that, oh, there's all these high rates of mental health problems and substance use and this and that. But it turned out once you factored in like support from schools and support from families, that was not the issue that folks originally thought it was. So even being able to speak about diverse sexual orientations and genders is protective of kids, because it gives people a place in their community and a place in their world.
And I've seen that in my own life. My partner and the producer of this podcast, his child is exploring gender orientation. So to be able to say, like, I've been profiled in a number of non-binary things. We existed before 2018. Like, we've been around. This is not just a trend, right?
Forever, right? And I think that's so important. I mean, I just, a few years ago, I have some family roots in Maine and was on some website and found, a link to some article about somebody I hadn't heard of. And the title was so intriguing. And it ended up being this really, really lovely profile of a man who lived in a nearby town where my family was from. And he, the words we would use today would probably be something like gender fluid. And it was such a lovely profile of him, but it was from like the 1860s, and I thought, again, like when we talk about the pendulum swinging, how was there such this accepting positive article in a major newspaper in Maine of this man who wore petticoats and like beautiful jewelry and high-heeled shoes, and it was like seen as like really interesting and affirming, like that this was his hobby, as they sort of talked about it, right? Like this is just who he is and what he likes. He loves
Mhm.
these lovely petticoats. But like, yeah, I mean, like these, like there have been always like a diverse group of people in every period of history, whether it's around sex or gender or, pick your thing. And so, yeah, being able to like speak to presence and reality and humanity can really matter to not only kids themselves who may have that sense of themselves, but also may have that sense of a family member. Oh, like that's who my mom is, or my dad, or my grandparent, or whoever. So it's just affirming.
Yeah, it's lovely to see that you are not alone in this world in how you're going through it. So you teach college kids. What is your sense of kids coming, university age kids and their understanding of their own sexuality and their own development? Is it changed over the years? Because you've been teaching for a while.
Yeah, I've been teaching for more than 20 years now. And it has changed of not only themselves, but each other. And it's so much more accepting than it used to be. I mean, when I started teaching it back in 2003, I think there was a lot less understanding of sexual and gender diversity. There was curiosity, but many college professors around the world will do something where they have like panels of people of diverse sexualities or genders come and talk and answer questions. Um and there just used to be many more questions about sexual orientation, gender, and there's not as as many anymore. And in fact, very often these days when students write their own papers or talk about themselves in class, they've had friends. Like today's college students have had friends since they were like 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 who described something about their sexuality or gender at these young ages, and like it didn't change the friendship. And it's just kind of, and it's mentioned sometimes in their papers really just in passing. And I thought, like this wasn't the case 20 years ago. So there's so much acceptance that I see for the most part. It's not always total, but for the most part, I think something that hasn't changed is that a lot of young people think that they need to have their sexuality figured out by the time they're 18 or 19 or 24, and they don't. So there's still a lot of reassurance around that, like, no, just kind of ask yourself questions, think about things, but you don't have to settle on an identity or, in any area or figure things out at these young ages. You can just kind of explore. There's still a lot of questions about, am I normal if, and it's about anything about their sex life or their body. So some things change and some things have stayed very much the same.
I have a number of fraternities that I do like healthy dating seminars for, and they're so cute about how they are really curious about different things, and a lot of them are actually much more concerned about their partner's pleasure now than they were 10 years ago, which is delightful. You talk about the pleasure gap. You've written on female pleasure. Kind of what are you seeing around discussions around orgasm gap, pleasure gap, and all of that? And is it changing for the better? I hope. As someone with a clitoris, I hope.
Yeah, I don't know that it's really changing for the better right now. I mean, sometimes I wonder actually if like this whole choking thing is like replacing an interest in orgasm for a lot of people.
Hmm.
Because when you can, lower the oxygen in the brain, then sometimes people experience some euphoric feelings. And so, yeah, so we actually see some decreases in orgasm for some people, and the gap is still pretty wide. It doesn't mean it will always be there. I think there is more conversation. I think, we've had a lot of conversations about clitoracy and the vulva and all of that. But I still think that we have a ways to go because just early in development, many young people are thinking about maybe what they like and they find pleasure. And I think it just takes people time to get to a sense of mutual pleasure and mutual
Hmm.
interest.
For a lot of people, you still experience shame or being shamed around masturbation when you're younger, which then limits that exploration, right? Because you feel bad about touching yourself or figuring that out. So for people who are starting to come into their own and go, okay, I want to explore this, I don't know where to start. What's a good entry point for people to start figuring out their own pleasure before you, because you have to figure that out before you can talk about mutual pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, certainly masturbation is one of the things that people can do. I would encourage people not to choke themselves while masturbating. We're seeing upticks in that. So when I talk about exploring your own pleasure, I'm thinking more about like breast, chest, genitals, and so on. I mean, other body parts too, but still would encourage, discourage people from doing anything really risky or dangerous, especially while they're alone and don't have somebody there to care for their safety. And also you can read, read erotica. I mean, a lot of my college students will find online erotica. Um, but also I think like having some sense of media literacy as you go into that can be really helpful because again, a lot of the media that's out there right now is actually encouraging some pretty dangerous things. And another one that maybe you're seeing, and I'm certainly seeing in our research and my college students is CNC or consensual non-consent. And, it's not that this can't be done safely. I mean, certainly within the kink community, there can be a lot of like support around, very explicit communication and consent and really kind of prescribing like where the negotiated limits and boundaries are and being sober and all of that. But what we're seeing in like college student populations and other young adult populations is people largely their version of CNC is largely like sort of role playing a rape scenario and often with like no real negotiation of limits or boundaries. It's sort of just like literally things like, I heard about this on TikTok or Reddit. Do you want to try it sometime? And then it just happens one day. And sometimes people feel okay about that, but quite a lot of times they don't. So a lot of like the book talk books that are popular right now are really creating those kinds of narratives around like sort of eroticizing rape scenarios. So I think it's a little tricky because throughout my career people have said, "Oh, like one way you can explore is read erotica." But like, be like a critical thinker of the kinds of erotica or the kinds of people you follow on TikTok, Instagram, other places,
Mhm.
because, you might ask yourself, like, who does this benefit? Like, who's creating this? Does this actually feel like it's for my benefit too? Or am I getting a pretty consistent narrative about the way, especially women are treated or trans and non-binary folks are treated? Because, when we keep seeing kind of the same groups of our already marginalized people keep getting marginalized, then I think it's also worth stepping back and saying, why is this what's being eroticized right now? Why is this the narrative that's being promoted? And again, it's not to shame anyone for that because like, like absolutely not like, but if we're being pushed this, I think we might want to ask why and if that feels like it's for us or not.
Yeah, we've had a number of erotic writers on this show, including some very high profile educators like Midori and Sinclair Sexsmith. And they're very honest about this is what I teach. This is the information to take into your actual sex life. This is the fantasy I write. And Midori is very clear about follow what I do in like the seductive art of Japanese bondage, not Han's daughter. Han's daughter is fantasy only, but really trying to make that distinction because it can be great in fantasy, but this is not instructional material.
Yeah.
And yeah, it becomes a hard line, especially if you straddle both worlds as an erotic, because a lot of us pay the bills with erotic writing and then we teach in sexuality. Speaking of such, you are a member of ASEC, you are ASEC certified. And I wanted to get your take on, there's a growing number of people who will identify as sex educators and kink educators with very little credentialing behind them. What is the role of credentialing now for sex ed? Because it's not cheap to get ASEC certified. It's like 5 grand. When you're vetting people to teach and to lecture, what sort of certification or credentialing should you look for?
That's a good question. I've personally found value from being an ASECT certified sex educator over the years, but I have some privilege in being able to do that because I'm at a university and I can get some support for, the continuing education credits and the other things that I've had to do to do that. And I have found that there's been value over the years, but it's not that, but I don't think it's only certified educators who are the only valuable ones. In fact, I don't know what the exact numbers are these days, but my memory is that there are far fewer ASEC certified sex educators than therapists. And so I think, my sense is that many sex educators don't personally feel the need to get a certification, and that's fine. But I do think from the perspective of people hiring somebody, whether they're certified or not, it is valuable to ask them, what they plan to teach, what their perspective is, maybe what kinds of resources they're going to share, because you may not agree with people certified or not. You may not want that information shared, certified or not. And, I do have some colleagues who have had some educators who are, I don't know if they were certified or not, but who over the years, for example, were kind of like their go-to person for a certain topic. But then as times change, and we've been talking about some of these changes and trends, I had one colleague who last year said, oh my goodness, like the kink educator I've been depending on for years to come into my class just came in and gave all this like inaccurate information about choking and like what, and so he just said, I can't have her back. I can't do it. Like I've trusted this person with my students and they just gave inaccurate information. So especially if it's something that is sensitive or it's changing, you might need to dig a little deeper than you did in the past. So I wish it was as easy as saying, oh, if you get somebody with a certain certification, it's fine. But, with anything else, it's like you've got to do your homework and find out what they're going to share. And, and I get asked that a lot with my research on choking and rough sex, like, oh, do you think this should be taught in high schools? And I've said, ideally, but I don't think we're there. I don't think that most people doing high school sex education or health education would be able to deliver fact-based and shame-free education on this topic, right? So I think that it depends on the topic and whether you want someone to come in and do like a birth control 101, versus a more nuanced, difficult topic and what you're looking for.
Well, and we still have many states that don't even require medically accurate information in high school, right? So let alone having a conversation about something more difficult like rough sex. No, the sex ed in this country is crazy to me at what we require and what we don't require students to know. I will say I've been keeping up on the research, and there's so much more now than even 5 years ago, and definitely compared to 20 years ago, there's so much more now around sex ed research. And part of that is there's just so much we don't know. So you've been doing the work around rough sex and trends on choking. Where do you see your research going next?
Oh, it's staying in that space. I mean, it's still so much we don't know. I mean, that we've really
Yeah.
just sort of scratched the surface. Certainly, I'm still doing some of the CNC research too, so you'll be seeing some more from our team on that. I still also just look at general sexual behavior trends in the U.S. Still care about things like orgasm and also just supporting my PhD students in their interests. So some of the stuff maybe departs a little bit from like, the area that I might study, but I'm here to teach interview skills, survey skills, all these other things to the next generation of sexuality researchers and help them find out new things that I never would have dreamt to.
Are there a lot of new students coming into the field, or is it still pretty small?
We are a growing field. It's a great time to be in sex research in lots of disciplines. I'm headed soon to a conference, and probably about half of our attendees are graduate students, and they're doing fascinating work. I mean, some of them are doing work on like sex robots or AI or using virtual reality to treat vaginismus and all sorts of things all around the world. And so we're also seeing some of our conferences get more international, which is interesting too, to see sex research start to grow in countries where there used to not be much of a presence at all.
For me, that's so exciting, right? Because when I applied to graduate school, there were 3 programs in the country in my field, which was political psychology. And now, like every other university has one. And I'm hoping the same happens in sex research because there's just so much interesting work coming out right now. For any listeners who may be going, ooh, I could do a graduate program in sex research, what would be your advice to them?
Oh, yeah. Well, yes. I mean, definitely explore our field for sure. And you might want to think about like the type of approach that interests you or the people. When I was thinking about people said, oh, like look for the people whose work you really like reading. And then, so originally I would have done psychology. I loved psychology, but the people whose work I was reading and who I really connected with were in public health. And,
Mm.
for me, I could make that trade off. I thought, yeah, I don't really see myself like seeing patients, as a full time career. So even though I would have liked some skills training in that area, I was good with going in public health. So for some people, it's the people. For some people, it's the geographic location where their friends or family or chosen family are, and that's where they want to be. But then you sort of find your field, you find your people, you apply to programs. If it's for like a master's or especially a PhD program, reach out to the faculty first and talk with them. And a lot of people don't know that. And so it can be good to do because especially for a PhD program, that faculty member may only be choosing one person that year. You're not usually accepting five. In fact, you're almost never accepting five people. It's like one or two or none. And so getting that personal relationship and finding out what kind of work they're doing. You can look on Google Scholar to see what they're doing most recently. For example, sometimes I get people reaching out saying, oh, I love your work on condoms. I'd love to come work with you, but I haven't really done condom research in like a decade. So, so seeing what people are doing most recently is where how you want to spend your effort. But it's a really, really great, growing, thriving field. And even if the work that you think is valuable doesn't exist yet, it doesn't mean it can't. And so it just might mean that you are the person to do it and you can come in and get the skills so that you can do exactly the kinds of work that you think the world needs.
And I have to really underscore how important it is to reach out to the faculty members in the programs and connect with them because that made a world of difference in me choosing my PhD program. The other thing is go with the money. If somebody's going to fund you, go with the money because God, that makes a difference on the back end. Professors are not rolling in, high six figures.
Right. Yeah. And, just to throw out some programs like Northwestern University,
Mhm.
amazing group around
Yeah.
sexuality. Here at Indiana University, we've got more than a dozen sex researchers in my school alone and dozens more beyond our school at IU. University of Minnesota, but like those are just a few of them. And if you're thinking like, I'm in a part of the country where like, there's only small schools and this and that, like you can, again, reach out to some of the faculty. Sometimes I hear from people, I think, oh, there's really none of us doing that work, here, but like I can give them 5 names of other people. So you can probably find your folks, and check out this field of sex research or education or therapy.
Yeah, it's a wonderful field. It's not what I went to university for, but on the back end, I would do it again in a heartbeat if this was an option when I was going in. Before we go, where can people find your work? Where can they buy your books? All of that good stuff. Plug your sites and socials.
Sure. Yeah, my book, Yes, Your Kid, and some of my other ones too are available in all the usual places. Your local bookstores can order them, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Bookshop, all of that. My research group is at sexualhealth.indiana.edu. And you can learn about me, my wonderful colleagues, our amazing PhD students, and other grad and undergrad students, and all the great things that they're doing and the work that they're doing, and hopefully feel inspired to say, maybe I could be a sex researcher too.
And listeners will have all of those links and more. I've been reading your research for years. I absolutely love it. Your popular books are very accessible, so we'll make sure we have all of those links for our listeners. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Texas of the world. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fat Chicks on Top. Please like, subscribe, and review our podcast on whatever platform you listen to it on. If we like your review, we may even read it online. This has been an Auntie Vice production. Producer and host, Rebecca Blanton. Audio production by Sharon Smith. Music by David Manga, and more music by Sharon Smith. For more information about Fat Chicks on Top, please visit our website for all things Fat Chicks at fatchicksontop.com.